This episode of the Forge podcast is brought to you by the generous donations of Thea Fattel, Jason Holloway, and David Morris, along with all of our other amazing Patreon supporters. If you would like to become part of the Forge community, you can learn more at patreon.com/ForgeGenesis. Thank you.
Correctly with the correct amount.
D20 Radio, where gamers roll.
www.d20radio.com.
Welcome to the Forge.
Hello, Gamer Nation, and welcome to the Forge, your Genesys RPG podcast covering everything that you need to know about the latest and greatest from Fantasy Flight Games' Genesys Foundry and the Genesys role-playing game. I'm your host, GM Hooley, and we have an episode tonight that is going to crank up the NOS and shift into 10th gear and drift all about Tokyo and yeah, I still know nothing about cars. You'd think I'd learned by now. But anyway, I do know about vehicle chases and races in Genesys, which we'll be diving into in the furnace. Also, we'll be returning to our Breaking the Mould segment with an exciting interview with RPG Narco himself, Roy Altman, to talk about his recent released Genesys Expanded Critical Tables, which is absolutely amazing and fantastically formatted. And, of course, we'll be answering your games and rules questions in Under the Hammer. For now, however, let me introduce you to my forever wingman, my co-pilot and navigator, the goose to my Maverick, the Starbuck to my Apollo. It's GM Chris. Chris, how you going?
Okay, I'm fine. I'm the Starbuck to your Apollo. I'm good with that. I'm Goose? I'm Goose? I'm the goose. You know what? If anything, I'm Iceman. Okay.
Right.
I'm gonna go with that. That's just yeah. But no matter how strongly our friendship and hosting relationship bonds, Hooley, I give you this solemn vow: I will never, ever do a half-naked volleyball montage scene with you.
No, that'd be like watching a lava lamp, wouldn't it? But
yeah, buddy. Oof. Or churning butter, something. Yeah, man.
Or something like that. That's a terrible image, and I apologize to all of our listeners for that image that we've just drawn for them.
Goose. That's what you get for Goose. Goose. Well, at least I got to be married to Meg Ryan. Well, young Meg Ryan.
That's true. That's true.
That's true.
But you tend to not like the canopy on a jet fighter very much. But
no.
Spoilers.
Spoilers. It's a bit late. Yeah. Spoilers.
It's what, 25 years old, 30 years old, that movie? Anyway. Craziness. All right. Look, Chris, I think it's time we get things underway. But before we get into the show all proper like, we do have to give you all, that's all you listeners, another reminder about the forthcoming
Forge Awards.
Deep voice included. Nominations are happening right now for the Forge podcast, honouring of the best Foundry products from the past 12 months. And there's a lot in there. Nominees will be voted on by the podcast hosts and our amazing Patreons. But Chris, can you tell us a little bit more about this nomination process?
Absolutely. So we've got public nomination awards in 4 categories: Best Adventure, Best Setting, Best General Supplement, and Best Layout and Design. If there is a product on the Foundry that was released between July 31st of 2019 and July 31st of 2020, you can nominate it. All you got to do is email us at forgegenesis@d20radio.com with the subject of Forge Award nomination. Tell us in your email why you want to nominate the product and for what category. And you can find more descriptions on what those categories mean at our website at forgegenesys.com. Also, we have decided to extend our nomination period due to some unfortunate technical issues on our last episode that delayed its release past the planned original date, which was at the beginning. We're going to be close to the beginning of August.
Yep.
Hence the delay of our original announcement of the Forge Award nomination opening.
And as a result, the 2020 Forge Awards nomination deadline has been extended to September 30, 2020. So now we know that there are obviously lots of time zones in the world, and we do have listeners in, I think, just about every time zone. But so we're not too worried about if it ends up, clicking over into October for some of our listeners, like in Australia, for example. Obviously, the States is behind. So once it clicks over to the October, that's when it will be the deadline. So make sure you get those in before September 30. After that, voting will commence for each category among the hosts and our Patreons with only one major rule. And now this is just to reiterate, no one can vote for a product that they contributed to. And that, in the interest of fairness, the hosts of the Forge podcast, that's Chris and myself, have recused ourselves for any products that we've been involved in. We will announce the winners by the end of October. Hopefully we'll have a show that will be at the start of October, and that's when the Forge Awards episode will air. And not only for those winners who will get a shiny digital Forge Awards winner badge that they can slap on their product. And you would have seen the preview of that on our announcements on Facebook and all of our social medias. But we'll also have some other little spiffy swag prepared as well.
And again, for more details, guys, head to forgegenesys.com and get those nominations in.
I'm so excited. It's going to be great.
Me too. So, Maverick. God.
You're not going to let that go, are you?
I'm not, because I think I feel the need.
The need for speed.
So should we take off into this episode with some new Foundry products, maybe?
Oh, absolutely. So let's fly into the danger zone in Stoking the Fire.
Stoking the Fire.
And welcome to Stoking the Fire, a segment dedicated to letting you know all there is to know about the releases from the Genesys Foundry and the Genesys role-playing game. But first, Chris, would you like to tell us about the D20 Radio podcast of the week?
Indeed. This week, I really wanted to highlight another excellent actual play podcast on the network, and that is The Story Told. TST is a highly entertaining group that does basically these mini campaigns across varied systems. So if you really want to strap in to discover some things maybe you've not played before, it's a great listen. And the group is just brilliant to listen to. Great stories, great arcs. It's just good, fun role-playing. And right now, the crew is actually in the midst of a wonderful journey they're taking in Exalted 3rd Edition called The Fall of Giara. So go and check that out, and you can find this and more amazing gaming and geekery podcasts over at d20radio.com.
I've never actually played Exalted before, but
I played first edition back in way back in the day.
Right. No, I've been told plenty about it, and a guy I used to work with always went on about his Exalted campaigns, but never had the opportunity. But anyway, check out The Story Told. It's a great podcast. And after you've perused the awesome podcasts and blog articles in d20radio.com, why not head over to the Genesys Foundry at Drive-Thru RPG, where you can find the latest and greatest Foundry releases for Genesys. And this week has seen some cool new releases, Chris. So what's our first one?
Yeah, so since our last episode, and as of the time of this recording, the first thing we got is the first one. We've got a couple from this author to talk about, but Lee Ironside released Cybernetics and Gmods, body modification catalog for use with Android Shadow the Beanstalk. And like Lee hit us up with his first product, which we mentioned last episode, which was the Gun Locker. And then he followed up like fast with Cybernetics and Gmods, a body modification catalog. I personally haven't had the chance to crack this one open yet. And its blurb is unfortunately a little less descriptive than the Gun Locker, but the product appears to contain the stats and descriptions for numerous cybernetic and Gmodded implants and their associated rules. And the title obviously expands upon the body modifications that are presented on page 104 of Android Shadow the Beanstalk. And Lee presents it on the Foundry as a tool for both players and game masters who are looking to obviously expand their choices of cybernetic and genetic modifications for both PCs and NPCs. So
yeah.
Interesting. It's got a price point of $4.99, which I think all of his releases have had to this point.
Yep.
But yeah, I'm interested to crack this one open and check it out. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. The cybernetics is certainly the interest of many a Shadow of the Beanstalk player. So he's certainly grabbed onto to that for sure. Our next title, however, is Genesys Toolset, which was quite interesting when I saw this one pop up. The author is Masked Man Games. So it says, why does this supplement exist? Well, after organising and arranging my own Genesys RPG space opera campaign, I developed the advantages and threats tables included in this supplement for a variety of areas, finding the need to expand on possible advantage and threat results during skill use, including combat. Rather than having to think swiftly and concisely on the spot, these were developed as tools to enhance gameplay, to keep the atmosphere intact and the events flowing. Regular pauses to interpret the dice during creative mental blocks delayed the game and impacted the atmosphere. They were also instrumental in maintaining consistency between advantages, threats, triumphs, or despairs during gameplay and proved so useful that I wanted to share them through the Genesys Foundry. They can supplement any existing advantage and threat tables or can be used in an alternative to the interpretation of the dice pools. Keep those players on their toes and keep it fresh. I don't know whether I'd want to be using it. It sounds exciting, but I just don't know whether that's something that I would find useful. But it may be useful for people who've never played Genesys or do struggle in that department to come up with ideas.
Yeah, I mean, and I've encountered that for a lot of I think players more often than GMs really often will occasionally struggle with that, especially as they're first learning the system, and before it gets on the tip of your tongue. So interesting.
Absolutely.
Very interesting.
And and it's a $4 cost. So
Now, next up, it of course wouldn't be an episode if we didn't talk about a release, at least one from the machine, Chris Markham, with one I'm actually incredibly excited to get on the table. I can't wait for this. Goblin's Gambit. And the blurb is trouble brews on the roads near the small village of Mistwood, with merchant wagons increasingly falling victim to ruthless yet unknown raiders. While not an uncommon occurrence, it's the random methods of these attacks that confound local law officials, preventing them from predicting the whereabouts of the next strike. It's not until the player characters stumble upon the remnants of one such attack, finding clues to the identity of the attackers, that the mystery blows wide open. Who is responsible for these attacks? Why are they kidnapping travelers but sending no ransom demands? And what madness drives the random nature of these attacks? And considering the title, we can all see where this is going. But yeah, Goblin's Gambit, man, it's a fantasy adventure for the realms of Terranoth setting, obviously, or any fantasy setting, honestly. Suitable for a party of 4 to 6. With 50 to 100 earned XP.
Yep.
I love that call out and saying, hey, this isn't an introductory adventure. This is, something that's there for people with a few sessions under their belt, which I really like. And I also really like the price, Chris, at $3, which is fantastic for an adventure module.
Absolutely. It's just a nice entry level module for PCs with just a little bit of experience. So that's sort of around about that, 4 to 6 sessions worth of gameplay. So if you're averaging that 3 hours. So yeah, absolutely fantastic. I've seen the module and it's amazing. Go and get it. It's really good. Our next title, our next title is Boost number 3. Deep Dive by the Community Project. Now, as I've had it explained to me before, this is basically an amalgamation of a whole heap of different things submitted by different people in the Discord community for Genesys, where they pile a whole heap of stuff together and just release it for free. Its blurb is: the Book of Online Source Triumphs is a Genesys community project with the goal of creating content that relates to a specific theme. Now, the theme for this issue is Deep Dive, one of my favorite environments this is going to be talking about. Inside, you'll find 15 new pieces of equipment, including 1 vehicle, which will aid you in underwater expeditions. 5 new adversaries appropriate for deep sea adventures. Yeah, absolutely. 5 new adversaries appropriate for deep sea adventures. 2 articles with GM advice for running underwater encounters. A micro adventure, Sunken Treasure, which can be adapted to fit any setting. And I believe that's also by Chris Markham. So well done. And the price is for free. So absolutely fantastic. Download it. I've taken a look at it as well, and it's really good this time. I love it.
That's fantastic. I don't think underwater gets enough love.
No, I agree.
In my opinion,
I agree.
Absolutely wonderful. And speaking of Markham, again, it wouldn't be an episode without having, I should say, I guess at least 2 titles that he's released.
Right.
But also Terranoth Treasures Volume 4, he recently released, which the blurb is more magical items. The 4th volume of the supplement provides 20 additional Terranoth magic items. Each is derived from classic magical items in various other fantasy roleplay games. Like previous volume, this product describes each item along with an illustration, rules for using it in Genesys, and the information needed for characters to craft their own. Very much similar to the other Terranoth treasures that he's released. And obviously, as usual, with his Terranoth treasure supplements, all these items, these components, the components to make them can serve as really cool adventure seeds, giving that GM some tools to motivate and challenge the players who look into craft.
Yeah.
So very, very interesting. Price, $2.50. It's a bargain.
Yeah, absolutely. It's great. Now, our last product for this week is another one by Lee Ironside, who has obviously stormed onto the market with a few supplements now, and they're pretty good. I haven't really had a chance to look at them too deeply, but they're not too bad. So the next one is career specializations, which I was very surprised to see, which are talent trees for use with Android Shadow of the Beanstalk. Within these pages, you will find career specializations and talent trees for all of the 10 careers presented in Genesys Shadow of the Beanstalk sourcebook. A total of 30 career specializations in total. Each specialization contains its own talent tree and career skills that allow players to create a variety of specialized characters with their game's master's approval. It is $4.99. I haven't been able to get my hands on this one yet, but that's a lot of work to do 30 career specializations.
God, yeah.
So I'll be keen to take a look at that.
I'm interested to. I don't know. I'd love to know more about how it was play tested, because that's a lot. I mean, as we talked about before when we had Sam on to talk about it, the amount of play testing for specializations is just insane.
Yeah, absolutely. When you start talking 30 of them, you've got to really look at how they all combine. What did he do with things like knack for it and stuff like that, because it doesn't necessarily translate into a specialization. So, will be interesting to take a look at that.
Well, some great products this week, and you guys can find all of them and so much more fantastic Genesys Foundry content over at drivethroughrpg.com, simply by searching using the words Genesys Foundry. And perhaps, Huli, DriveThruRPG is also a great place for listeners to take a look at all the cool products they can nominate right now for a Forgy Award.
Right, you are, Chris. And since you've raised the topic of the Forge Awards, remember, listeners, that only Patreons of the Forge podcast can vote on those nominations. So why not jump over and become a supporter of the Forge by joining our Patreon for as little as $2 a month. You can also access our dedicated Discord server where you can interact with other fellow Genesymiths. Is that how we say it? Genesmiths? While higher tiers provide priority for your games and rules questions, special in-show recognitions, and even a special monthly get-together with either Chris or myself to discuss your Foundry product, campaign, games, or anything else that you want. Counselling, we can even do that if you want. No, we can't, but it's nice to think that. What else, Chris, could we talk about?
The weather, funny jokes, apps that you're really enjoying right now, fatherly advice given to you by old men. We can do it all.
We can't guarantee it's good advice, but
I just said advice. I didn't say it would be good advice.
So yes, well, that's my disclaimer anyway.
All the advice I have to give
yes.
is like it was all given to me by like my grandfather and father, which means it's wildly like it's aged horribly. It's like it's good advice, but the verbiage is like is misogynistic or just very it's aged very poorly. like very poorly, right? When I first went to the workplace, my father gave me a piece of advice, which is actually good advice. I just wish it was told to me in a much more appropriate way. And it was a very simple statement.
Right.
He said, remember, don't get your meat where you get your bread.
What does that even mean?
It's about inter-office relationships.
Right. Yes.
You getting it together there? Okay.
Yep.
And it's really good advice. I just wish it wasn't presented in such a horribly misogynistic format. But that's we all have emotional baggage, right?
Right.
Mine is pretty tame compared to other people, so I guess I'm fortunate.
We know that best here in Australia as "don't screw with a crew." But
that's about right. That's about right. And so, guys, if you want to join our Patreon, you can get some highly suspect advice from us. Ideally, hopefully, about your games, which is what we really want to do for our patrons.
Yeah, there's been absolutely some amazing discussions over there recently with regards to adversary creation and a bit of a discussion about the rules that we answered in the last episode, talking about the called shot. So there's been some interesting discussions there. But no matter what, anything you can spare to show your support is appreciated. And each of your donations help the podcast directly so we can continue providing you with excellent regular Genesys content. So join the Forge community by becoming a supporter at patreon.com/Forge Genesys. Okay, Chris, we're out of the danger zone and ready, it seems, to hit Mach speed towards our dogfight of vehicle chases and races. No, I very much like the fighter plane analogy, but though I know as little about jets as I know about cars.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. But yeah, man, I've been really wanting to dive into this topic for a long time, and it's been a very hotly requested one: chases and races. Mm-hmm. We got some rules to drop on you and a lot of house rules to drop on you.
Yeah.
But these are things that have been borrowed from already tested systems and tested, and retested house rules and modifications that Huli and I have both experienced just ridiculously heavily through nearly a decade of narrative dice play now. So I'm really excited to drop into this. Let's race headlong into the Furnace.
The Furnace.
And welcome to The Furnace, the segment where we take a deep dive into a topic concerning custom creations using the Genesys role-playing game. Now, over the past few months, during several of our episodes, we've sent ourselves off to the mechanic for a fuel-injected overhaul by exploring the vehicle rules using the narrative dice system. Now, in episode 15, starting your engines number 1, the first of engine, we took a long look at vehicles. First, we laid out the skills used to operate and steer vehicles in our diecasting segment, and then followed that up with a look at vehicle statistics by explaining what they all mean and how to use vehicles mechanically to get them from point A to point B. Now, that gave us enough information to explore vehicle combat in episode 17, starting your engines number 2, Cruise Control, where we discussed the options that GMs and players can use to mount spectacular vehicle combat scenes. We also explained how you can use the Genesys vehicle rules in your Star Wars game, and then we took a long look at the rules for encounter zones and how they can make your vehicle and personal scale combat easier to visualize in your games.
And it was one long episode, Hooli.
It was. But not to be outdone, on that same episode, we ran a short combat scenario to show you how it all comes together. And it was a lot of fun.
Oof. Yes, it was. And then finally, in episode 20, starting your engines number 3, ramming speed, where we explain the rules for collisions and critical hits and how their use in combat can make it all that more precarious yet exhilarating in vehicle combat. And all that means that we've given you all about 6 hours of vehicle rules content at this point.
Yep, pretty much. So with that in mind, tonight we'll be continuing our look at vehicles with the third of the 3 Cs, with a look at chasers and races.
Okay, Uli. So we've looked at all manner of vehicles in these past episodes, and our regular listeners should have a clear idea of what we're on about. But what if this is the first time hearing about the Forge and it's your first time listening?
Look, that's a really good point, Chris. And now, as we've mentioned in all of our episodes about vehicles thus far, we want to ensure that both GMs and players alike can use the vehicle rules with ease. And we want them to gain a better understanding of how the rules work and how to use them best in their games. But we also want to obviously highlight any weaknesses the rules may have that we discovered during our research into the rules by offering some suggestions and fixes like we did with encounter zones. But we also want to provide information to authors on how to present vehicle encounters when creating products for the Foundry. And how have we done that, Chris?
Well, as I mentioned before, Huli, we've spent quite a few hours already digging into the vehicle rules, and we don't want to have to summarize them every time. Right. So, guys, simply put, if you haven't done so already, go back and check out those episodes we mentioned before, episodes 15, 17, and 20, before listening to this episode.
Right. So we're going to assume that basically you've listened to all of those episodes, and if something isn't making any sense, go back and familiarize yourself with that content.
Mm-hmm. All right, Uli, let's get into this. Where do you want to start? Chases and races. Where do we even start?
Well, look, obviously the overall arcing sort of topic is going to be about chases. We will include some details later on about racing because it can be handled differently. But for a start, let's just look at chases. Why do chases exist in RPGs, and why do players just desire them so much in their games? I think for me, chases are pretty exciting. There's lots of narrative elements that can be thrown into the mix depending on the scenario. Look, the changing environments that we see as they move through whatever sort of urban environment or forest jungle, or even, as we mentioned before, about underwater adventures. There's plenty of things that can pop up there. So that's the reason why it's normally the most exciting part of an adventure.
And it's a classic trope, right? I mean, look, it doesn't matter whether you're reading a comic or you're watching a movie or a television show. It's like if you get the heroes into a large or less than large vehicle or on the back of a beast, okay, and you go galloping off or racing off at ludicrous speeds, there's just a huge amount of excitement that comes from the jeopardy that places those characters in, as well as the overall challenge.
Yeah.
But also, I think it's important to note that it really provides yet another avenue for certain characters to show off their skills and their capabilities. I mean, the concept of the pilot, right? Or the driver, or or quite frankly, the expert rider, the cavalryman, or the dragoon, okay, is a very, I mean, it is a trope that is present in virtually every setting you can think of. Whether it's fantasy to all the way running the gamut to space opera. You've got somebody who's is the ace behind the reins or behind the wheel or behind the stick. And it's a classic trope that a lot of players are really drawn to. And so I love, as a GM and a writer of adventures, I love it because it allows, as we all GM should, to find yet another way to showcase a particular character. And once every other session or so, give that character a real moment to shine and celebrate the trope that they have decided to devote themselves to.
And it also allows player creativity as well.
Oh, yeah.
That they might start using skills that, they don't otherwise use. I've seen a diplomatic character start, using those skills to hurl abuse at the pursuers, for want of a better term. And, that sort of allows them to go, well, how can I use my skills? Because, the driver and the gunner, they're obvious choices for that sort of a scenario. And they don't necessarily get a lot of love either. So these sort of scenes really highlight that. It's lots of action, really exciting stuff. The other thing that I really like about chases is you can use it as a writer. You can use it to explain what point they are at the story, or even what the stakes are for what they're chasing or what they're protecting. So it basically allows them to really explain the stakes for what their actions are within the story. So that's an important thing as well.
This is it's interesting to look at it this way. And I think we're going to come back to this in a minute when we talk about what a chase is. But, any good story has goals and obstacles.
Right.
And literally those things are highlighted in a physical sense through a chase. I think about, some of my favorite chases from popular stories, that are out there. And I'll go to movies. Have you ever seen Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom?
Have I?
Okay. So we have a MacGuffin. Okay. Yep. In this case, 3 MacGuffins. All right. The Los Sankara stones, Balijarto. And they've been stolen, and obviously at this point that's the goal, that's the objective, and the obstacle is the fact that you now have the bad guys that are trying to get them from you. Okay, and that is highlighted through one of the most iconic scenes in the film that blew my mind when I was a kid. Seeing this in a theater, which was, of course, the minecart chase. All right. Just absolutely fantastic, and it's such a great RPG scene. It's so great. You've got difficult terrain that comes into place, and people using all different kinds of skills in that interaction, and combat, and even environmental effects.
Yes.
To an incredibly strong degree. So speed plays into it as well.
Yep.
Yeah, dude. It's a great RPG chase. It really is.
And who says that you can't do a chase on rails? Because the minecarts don't really they can't go off where they want them to. They're stuck on this on the rails. So and it is an exciting scene that I can watch time and time again.
But what does that chase inform the viewer about the story? It tacitly reinforces both the objective and the challenge. Because of the drama it adds to the scene, it reinforces very subtly to the audience and very meaningfully how important the Shankara stones are, and not only to those that have just stolen them, but also to those that are trying to get them back, the bad guys.
Yeah.
And that, and that incredible sense of importance and agency on both parties of a chase reinforces what's important. And honestly, if we think of really good chase scenes from other, major films or other media, you're going to find that pattern repeated. And when you're designing your chases and your adventures, the chase should be there to focus on that typically.
Yeah. Another one of my favorite is The Matrix. But that's a really good example of, and I'm talking the first one here, as they're running from the agents. So after Trinity manages to get back to the real world, and the agent shoots the phone. So Neo was there by himself. And so that's kind of telling the story that he's alone. He's got to do this by himself. And that's where he basically turns around and says, right, I'm going to give this a golly good show. And I had to edit myself then. But then he sort of like tries that, realizes that the agents are insanely powerful. And so even though that he's managed to subdue one of them, when he comes back off the train, he's got to start running again. There's an end goal because we know as he contacts Tank that there is a point that he has to get to. So that's sort of showing that, he is, I mean, ultimately it's to show that he is the one. But
he is the MacGuffin. He is the MacGuffin in that chase.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there are countless others. We don't have to go through all of the Star Wars ones, but the asteroid field in The Empire Strikes Back is another really good one.
Oh my lord, yeah.
Where they are all the MacGuffin. Predominantly, Vader wants them so that he can use them to draw out Luke. It's showing that Han is really absolutely insane when it comes to piloting, but he is the best of the best. So that's just another example to highlight the skills of a character that we've known about since for whenever.
That was really the first moment, and where honestly the audience understood what a pilot that Han was.
Yes.
Because in episode 4, with the budget they had, he wasn't there for the dogfight. Okay, he came at the last minute to mop up and leave. Okay.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
That was the first moment that the audience got to see what a pilot he was. You're not actually going into an asteroid field. They'd be crazy to follow us, wouldn't they? I mean, that was, so again, that character agency showing, don't tell, show a character's capabilities. My favorite chase scene with incredible stakes in recent, maybe the last, it's not recent actually, it's a couple decades old now, I guess, or darn near. I am a leaf on the wind. Watch how I soar. With, again, we know that Wash is an incredible pilot, in Firefly and then in Serenity, but they show us in what is really an incredible chase scene where they're being chased by a series of Reaver ships, in the middle of an active battlefield. And, what an incredible scene that was.
Yes, I'd totally forgotten about that.
And they have the MacGuffin. They have the information. They have what they need to get down, to broadcast it, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, man.
Lots of cool things. So that's the reason why chases exist in RPGs, because, it's the fun, ultimately. But what is a chase? That's our next question. Chases are everywhere in RPGs. As we've said, they're everywhere in movies. Foot chases, car chases. And look, during one of the bits of research that I was doing in relation to chases, especially when it comes to storytelling and film, is that even a social combat is technically a chase. And I never actually thought about that. That's not sort of what we're going to be talking about tonight, because we're obviously talking about vehicle combat. But it is technically a chase. And it goes to the definition of what a chase is. The definition is a chase occurs when a character wants or needs something and there is an obstacle in the way of that need. When you've got those elements in play, that's when a chase happens. So it can be in the courtroom drama where you need to get this particular character off a charge of treason or whatever. The need is to have them off. The obstacle is they've got to go through this trial to be able to get their associate acquitted.
And, and another common theme about a chase is often, not always, and I do want to talk about that, but often it's not just that there's an obstacle. Like, there is an obstacle, but that obstacle is, what I'm trying to say is that obstacle is usually another party. Okay.
Yeah.
In the case of to use your example, it's a prosecutor. Okay.
Yeah.
Or in the sense of a typical chase, it's the opposing party, whomever they might be, reavers, thuggy cultists, right? Stormtroopers, Imperial pilots. But not always. Sometimes the environment itself can present the obstacle and lead to a chase without enemies, and that is still totally okay and still totally within the rules we're going to talk about. To go back to Indiana Jones, if you dial things back by one movie and you go to Raiders of the Lost Ark, there was a fantastic chase scene that happened at the very beginning of the film with a collapsing temple and Indy trying to get out. Okay. That was a chase scene without an opponent. The environment was the opponent. Okay. In Star Wars, we see a great opponent-driven chase scene through an asteroid field. And then 3 scenes later, we see a short chase to successfully get out of the asteroid field, or I should say out of the belly of a space slug, which you could technically classify that as the opponent, but really it's environment. Okay.
Yeah. Well, speaking of that, where is the best place for a chase to occur?
Well, okay, so a chase should challenge the players. Otherwise, it's not really going to provide the emotional and story-driven impetus for doing it in the first place.
That's right.
Its aim is to, as we said, is an attempt to prevent them from doing or obtaining something, and that includes simply getting to safety. But and you can play with that, man, because the best chases, Hooli, occur when crap gets in the way. Like asteroids.
Exactly. I mean, that's something that, to plug the Order 66 podcast, that was something that I learned very early on in the when I was listening to you guys, that was, when it comes to doing vehicle combat, it really is let crap get in the way, because if you're just doing it in an open field, that's pretty boring. And I'm sure there's better ways to do it rather than a chase. But when crap gets in the way, there's stakes at hand there. You could get killed. You could all blow up. All of your friends could blow up. If an asteroid, or if you're in if we use Star Trek for example, when you've got Vulcan, which is imploding. Bits and pieces of temples are basically falling on your head. That's another example of stakes that you've got to get everybody to safety with the environment.
Do you know why, from a storytelling standpoint, that is so important? Because when players are big damn heroes, whether it's on the game table or on a television show, the audience or the player expects the big damn hero to be the best at what they do. Right. Okay, it's like wow, there's no chance that the stormtrooper's going to catch him, right? There's no chance the reaver's going to outrun Wash. Okay, there's no chance. There's a suspension of disbelief to say otherwise, because you believe in big damn heroes. But strangely enough, the same cannot be said when you add another element into the mix, because that becomes the wild card that quote unquote evens the odds.
Yeah.
Okay. Whether that be juking between canyon walls, whether that be a foot chase, not on an open field, but across the rooftops of Adelaide. Okay. Yep. Whether that be instead of a race down a hallway, after stealing something and evading security guards, it becomes a chase through underground sewers and tunnels, to avoid capture. And sloshing through the muck and maybe dealing with wildlife and stuff like that. I mean, you feel me?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. This is why the chase is so much fun, because there are these additional things that get in the way from an RPG perspective. But yeah, it definitely does level the playing field, because if it was just an open field, well, anybody can run through an open field. They just need to run really, really fast. But not everybody can be able to be, jumping between racing cars. Or if we look at episode 2, where they had the speeder chase when they were after Zam Whistle, is like jumping out of speeders and landing on another speeder and stuff like that. That is your environment that you're talking about. Everybody, I don't think there's anybody out there who doesn't fear heights in some way, shape, or form. And to know that that's the environment that you're in, people automatically go, we're a long way up. If we fall out of this, we are going to die. And I think that's adding in that element to go, wow, they are heroes, because I would never do that myself.
Exactly.
So that's a bit of a brief overview of what is the best thing for chasers, where you should run a chase, what chasers actually are, and the purpose of them in an RPG session or a supplement. But how do you actually run a chase? And this is the million-dollar question. Now, chases are most often massive set pieces when you're looking at a film. They have big budget effects. They've got explosions and crashes where they're totaling, 50 or more cars. Huge budgets also means a lot of planning. Now, as we've said on this very show before, and Chris has said it on Order 66, and I've said it on Dicepool, that copious planning at an adventure is not a good idea.
No.
Instead, you should have some notes about where you'd like to take the story, but don't overplan it. You can do this more easily with certain events that you might want to have happen. So you may have something, for example, you want the PCs to know that they're being followed or watched. The PCs, you make them easily spot their tail, who is, the one who's been monitoring their movements. And they can either choose to engage, or if they know their foe is superior, that they may choose to flee the scene. In both of those cases, it more than likely leads to an exciting chase scene, because the person who's been monitoring their situation wants to get away. So the PCs then become the one who are the pursuers, where if they flee, the guy who's been looking at them still wants to know where they're going and what they're up to. So he then becomes the pursuer, and the PCs become the chasees.
Absolutely. I think of, the last chase I ran in game, the party had stolen something. Right? Mm-hmm. And I knew there was a very high chance that they were going to get noticed. If not on their way in, definitely on their way out. Okay. Mm-hmm. It was basically any despair result was going to trip an alarm. Okay. Mm-hmm. And they succeeded in the theft, but they rolled a despair at some point and they tripped an alarm. So now everyone's alerted to their presence and they're on their way out. Okay. Mm-hmm. And this was actually a modern game. This was it was Urban Arcana in Genesys. Mm-hmm. And the notes I had laid out for myself were chase. Okay. I had a rough stat block for the guards that would be chasing them. Yep. Okay. Mm-hmm. So I knew what their dice pools would be. Mm. All right. And I had a few raw notes about environmental effects that I would have in my back pocket to come into play. Right. And I just let the rest go organically. Mm. All right. Mm-hmm. Now, in that instance, I'm talking about very much running the chase rules like as written, which we'll talk about, which they're not specific rules for chases. It's just the, positioning, force movement, reposition, the standard vehicle movement rules that we have, which is we'll talk about actually handle chases shockingly well compared to Star Wars, which had to develop an entirely different set of rules, unfortunately, for chases. And those are great rules, but you don't necessarily need them. No. But the last time I did that was in that scenario. But the other way I've done it even more recently that I ran a chase scene was in a Weird West game, with my Dusters and Dragons setting. And we actually handled that through a skill challenge, which is a totally different way of handling it that I know we'll talk about. But in all of these avenues, man, you don't want to overplan. Understand if there's going to be opposing checks, understand what those dice pools are going to be, or at the very least, that way you can have difficulty if the PCs are making an opposed check, right? Right. And understand your basic environmental effects and just let the scene flow, because it's going to get crazy. I mean, especially if you're doing it right with environmental effects in a chase, crap's going to go off the rails so fast. Like, you do yourself a disservice, almost more so than any other avenue of encounter planning than by seriously over planning a chase.
Because those, those despairs and triumphs can change things so dramatically that it's crazy. But look, when it comes to a chase or designing a chase, especially, and this is more so for the people who are designing products for the Foundry, is that you don't want to flesh out the chase completely. Like, if in round 1, this particular thing happens, and in round 2, that particular thing happens. A chase, if done properly, can go for a very, very long time. In fact, it can almost go for an entire session. So, I mean, they design movies around a chase which goes from point A to point B. And it's just all the stuff that happens in between. As I said, it can go for several rounds or multiple segments of several rounds. So instead of plotting the chase out in its entirety, what you do is you just flesh out certain scenes or obstacles within the chase to give it a little bit more flavour. So, this gives the PCs a bit of an idea or of the scope of the chase, in that it's not just a street that you're running down that it's got a few dumpsters in it. It's that the chase can go on for the length and breadth of an entire city, for example. It's all the little bits and pieces that happen along the way that are the obstacles of the chase. And a good example of this is in Friends Like These, which Keith Capel wrote, and there's a chase scene in that where it just shows certain parts of the chase. So it's just like any adventure that you don't necessarily want to play out exactly how it has to be. It doesn't necessarily need to affect the story or whatever else. It's just an exciting part of the story. Now, you may be wanting to highlight something. Maybe you're wanting to highlight that the chase suddenly goes into a shanty town and that something happens in the town as you're running through it. So there's other things that you can put in there to, rather than just saying chase. But I mean, if you're running everything on the fly, just put, chase. That's what'll happen. But as you've said on Order 66 in the past, Chris, is you have those little set pieces. What's a really cool thing that might happen during this chase? And put that in there. And that will make your chase a little bit more exciting, a little bit more diverse.
One example we didn't really talk about, I'm a huge fan of James Bond. I grew up with James Bond.
Yes. Didn't we all?
and so many great chase scenes in Bond films, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I have to note that this is I'll keep this PG for the podcast. But in Bond films, there is an incredibly common, and this is just a narrative flair, a narrative touch.
Right.
Whether it's James Bond or Howard the Duck or anything with even a mildly adult bent to it.
Right.
The chase always ends up exposing a hapless random pair of NPCs that are en flagrant. Okay. You know what I'm talking about, right?
I do.
It's like they crash through a window, right? And this couple jumps up out of bed like, right? You know what I mean? Bond's on skis, flying down, the Alps and bursts through the top window of a chalet and out the other window, sailing over the heads of a Swiss couple, like. It's a fantastic narrative flourish that you can add when you're running this that will get a chuckle at the table and puts everyone in the zone, like, right away.
Yeah, exactly. It immerses them in the scene, that it's just not about rolling dice and seeing who's racing ahead. It is this narrative moment. And you can have things like that pop up throughout an adventure, or even throughout a campaign. If to go back to Star Wars, we have the scene where I think it's supposed to be Sebulba, but like older in a speeder that's going past when Obi-Wan and Anakin are chasing after Zan.
Yeah.
And he yells out, Yapudu. Things like that. And I mean, The Matrix has got the one with the old lady knitting as he's racing through these rooms.
Yep.
So there's all sorts of things, and you can have them pop up to add a little bit more depth to the world. So these things pop up.
So, Hooli, we've hinted at it until now, but let's get into the mechanics here, man.
Yeah,
because we got to talk about this. There's several different ways you can run a chase in this system.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are three main ways that you can do it. You can do it, as Chris mentioned before, you can do it as a skill challenge using competitive checks. And that's a really, really simple way, especially if there's no gunfights or anything like that. It's just you might be tailing someone and somehow they've managed to get onto you and you just want to know where they're going. You could run it just as a simple skill challenge, which, it's just the first to a total number of successes that they win. This is also a really good way to do races.
Yes.
I'll talk about races a little bit more in a tick, but that's a great way to do races, and you can do it with multiple people. And you can use, successes, advantage, threats, triumphs to add that narrative flair. The next thing that you can do is you can run the chase rules as written, which is, and there's no specific chase rules, but you can basically, rules as written, run a chase using Genesys. You just keep track of positions based on force movement and the reposition maneuver.
Yep.
And that's really, really simple to do. You can do it on cards. You can do it on anything.
And this is where speed and the various pilot maneuvers and actions that control speed really matter and can often come into play.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's the second option. The last one is and we will go through this because we know that a lot of people that play Star Wars listen to this podcast as well. And you can run a chase as per the rules for Star Wars.
Yeah.
However, well, actually, I won't drop that bombshell, but we'll wait until later on once we've gone through that. So running a chase in Genesys, as I said before, there's no defined chase rule mechanics at all. Star Wars has a defined set of rules. The problem with that is that it's an entire different mechanic, and you have to drop certain parts of the standard rules to be able to use a chase in Star Wars.
Yeah.
You have to suspend disbelief insofar as the way that the turn operates and what the actions and options for some of the participants are going to be. And that can become really frustrating, especially if you're trying to get new players into the game and suddenly they've got this whole idea of what vehicle combat is, and then all of a sudden you're changing that so that it's something else.
Yeah.
It can leave people scratching their heads. So I think that firstly, before we get into like a step-by-step, we have some points to consider, yeah?
Yeah. It's important to note this. A great deal of the action in a chase is going to be very narrative in nature. All right. And listen, this is the narrative dice system. We should expect that, but it's going to be heavy here as well. And skill checks obviously can and will resolve the outcome of the chase, but the action during the chase is going to be mostly narrative. And as such, describing that chase is up to the GM and the players, while describing, I think, the environment the chase occurs in and those challenges, Hooli, is largely up to the GM.
It is, and but let's not forget though that the GM, the players can also make recommendations for changing the scene, whether that be triumphs or flipping a story point, that they want some sort of narrative effect to happen within the environment that the GM has presented. And that's always an option, and that's also allowing the players buy-in into the scene. They're really much more invested in it because they've created it. So that's going to encourage other players to do similar things. And then suddenly by about midway through the chase, everybody is sort of describing what's actually happening, and people are saying, wouldn't it be cool if we do this? And there'll be planning that's going on. And so you've got this collaborative storytelling. And I think that in all of my time playing in the narrative dice system, chases, people just get how to tell a collaborative story a lot more than anything else, because they're all contributing in some way to what's happening around them. And the dice rolls happen really quickly, and the action is present. So yeah, that's something to consider there. But one of the things that I would recommend to anyone running a chase, because it can sometimes get a little bit daunting when you start talking about, especially if you've got a vehicle that's traveling at speed 5, that suddenly they can move, 3 range bands. And that can sometimes be a little bit daunting within itself, because you're then going to need to track whereabouts everyone, and you're going to run out of table space if you're using cards or whatever else. That you consider using the encounter zone rules that we talked about in one of the previous vehicle episodes.
Yes.
So, you can just use those hexes to work out where things are in relative to other people, especially if you're doing a scene where you've got people wanting to jump between vehicles, which is always a classic trope as well. Or they want to zoom ahead and run past them and try to block them off and things like that. You've got an idea of the space that you're in. So highly recommend using that. And just to summarize that, for those who want the very, very brief version, you just have to remember that each single encounter zone equals the distance a character. That's a character, not a vehicle. A character can move in a single maneuver. Each range band above short equals 2 encounter zones. And that works really well with the rest of the rules, for that it takes 1 maneuver to move from short to medium, 2 maneuvers to move from medium to long. That works in all with that. And the other thing is that vehicles move 2 encounter zones per point of forced movement. That's another thing to remember. So that's the summary, and that took us about an hour to explain. But that's a summary of that.
Yeah.
All right, so let's get into the step-by-step process, and we'll mention Star Wars a fair bit, so if you're not familiar with it, we will try to explain it as best as we can.
Yeah.
And then we'll go through how we think those rules can be modified to make things easier.
Yeah.
All right, so what's our first step, Chris?
Distance. It kind of makes sense when you're talking about a chase, especially a race, but you've got to determine distance. That is step 1. When the chase starts, calculate how far away the vehicles are from each other. Now there is no rule for a set distance, but our personal suggestion just from play is to start the chase at short to medium range if the person being chased is unaware. Okay? If they are aware they're being chased, I typically like to start at medium to long range. Now, because I'm very familiar with them, the Star Wars rules mention specifically choosing character or vehicle scale for the chase, which, as we've talked about, is unnecessary in Genesys, unless you are in the deepness of space or something where scales change drastically. But normally that doesn't really matter in Genesys.
Yeah, exactly. Now, step 2, we kind of got to break this up into 2 parts because we're talking about chases and races. So firstly, let's talk about a race. So in a race, the next thing that you would do is you would make a competitive check. Now, you can do that for all of the participants in the race, but each of the operators of the vehicle makes a control skill check. Now, obviously, the skill is going to depend on what's used to operate that particular vehicle. Or if you're doing a foot race, you would use athletics, for example, or depending on the scenario, it might be a cross-country type type race, in which case you might be using coordination, you might be using resilience as some options there as well. Now, for the difficulty, it's simple. It's not simple because that's a difficulty. The difficulty is the silhouette of the vehicle in difficulty dice. Genesys changed this, in my opinion, for the better. There was too much confusion when it came to the formula that Star Wars had. When they entered terrain in a standard combat. For chases, it had a different set of difficulty, which was based on the terrain. And that it goes actually contradictory to the way that things work normally. So keep it simple. Just use the Genesys rules that we've said numerous times. The base difficulty is silhouette of the vehicle in difficulty dice. The modifications to that dice pool is going to be the vehicle's speed, and that's where upgrades come in, and that's found on page 221 in table 3.2-14. And then, of course, terrain, which is purely represented by setback dice.
Yes.
And that's on table 3.2-15 on page 227. So that's when you're doing a race. But what about a normal chase, Chris?
Well, a normal chase, I mean, is honestly, it's a little easier. Vehicles move using normal vehicle rules in Genesys, including forced movement. And very important, as we talked about in our prior vehicle episodes, allow for the reposition maneuver. Okay, very, very important when you have forced movement and you want to get that extra oomph. All right. That's the simplicity. You don't need a separate system. You really don't. Okay. No. You could just use the standard rules. Another suggestion, though, is to, and I love this. You're more familiar with this with me, but I've not run it, but I've played it. I think you may have actually done this for me. Was using the pack of playing cards. Yeah,
exactly. And what it is that the playing cards, you designate a suit as a particular environment. Okay.
That was it. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then you might have, well, obviously you've got the scale of one, or from an ace all the way through. And then what you can be doing is you can be using, well, that's how difficult that particular environment is if there is a difficulty to it. So things can play out that way. Another one that I've seen that I use, or have used when I was playing Pathfinder a lot, is chase cards. They have several packs. I don't know whether they've got a third one, but I know there's definitely two, that they have specific environments in them. There's an urban one, there's a dungeon one, there's one for a village, and things like that you can just randomly lay them out onto the table and say, this is where the chase is. And because of the way that movement operates in the forced movement rules, you can just say, right, well, on this in this range band, this is what you can see ahead of you. And especially if you're in a city where you don't know what is around the next corner, you can be using things like some sort of foresight or something like that to know what's ahead of you. And so you can start to plan for that. That's another really cool way of doing it. Another way is to basically design your own with totally random factors in them, specifically to your scene. There's plenty of random tables out there which do that same sort of thing. That you can. I think in one of the RCR, I think it was for D20 Star Wars. There was a supplement for Tatooine, and it had rules for running a pod race. And I've used that numerous times to basically design a track. And then you just start adding your narrative flavor to it. Works really well if you've got a track that you have to do numerous laps on. as well. But probably my favorite way to deal with that when you're talking about a random factor, I guess, of throwing in things is where you just roll behind the screen or roll secretly just a setback die. If it turns up blank, nothing happens. If it's a threat, you can add a narrative effect to the current area that they're in, or you can add an additional setback die to the next dangerous drive check that they do. And if you roll a failure, well, the dangerous driving check is going to be required.
The tools are at your disposal. You don't need anything special.
No, not at all. And then we've got step 3. Now, this is interesting. So this is where you compare the results. Now, this is straight out of Star Wars and mainly applies to your competitive checks with a race. Okay. So you compare the total successes as per normal for a competitive check. If the pursuer wins, they can close the distance to a target by 1 range band. If the chased wins, they open the distance between them and the pursuer by 1 range band. Yeah. So that's one way. Now, this is, as I said, straight out of Star Wars. If the winner's speed is greater, you add an additional range band to their movement, either closer or further away, depending on the pilot's intention, equal to the difference in their forced movement value. Now, this may seem like the chase will come to an end really, really quickly when you start adding total range bands. But to be doing that sort of stuff, you really don't want the chase to go for more than 3 to 4 rounds anyway.
3 rounds is the magic number.
So try to keep them to that because it's supposed to be fast and furious, pun intended, to go into that. And then to win the chase, the pursuer must get to engage range, or in which case you would flip over to a standard combat, or the chased moves to beyond extreme range. So in other words, if they get to strategic range. And this is where we should have some sort of warning alarm, is that the biggest problem with the Star Wars rules is that it changes the existing rules, and I mentioned this before. It changes the existing rules to become a separate system, which goes against what Genesys, what its core belief is to make it simple so that players can focus on the narrative of the scenario.
And we've talked about this. We talked about it in vehicles when talking about the differences between Genesys and Star Wars. You know what I mean? That there is a very clear distinction being made, which focuses on not having, for lack of a better term, 2 separate rule sets to a large degree. Where what's good for the goose is what's good for the gander. It's fewer things for a player to have to keep track of and remember.
Absolutely. And if you want to do that whole, especially if you're not necessarily doing it as if you're doing it like as a competitive check race, you could be using triumphs or advantages to start closing or widening the gap. You just have to make sure, especially if you're writing for the Foundry, is that you mention in there players could use a triumph to further the gap, or despairs can be used to shorten the gap. And then you might suggest 3 or 4 advantages to do the same sort of thing. So the other thing to remember is that system strain loss will keep things in check. So don't forget that as well. It's just like magic, I guess, in that regard, that, system strain on the vehicle, because most vehicles don't have, especially when we're talking, motorcycles or cars or trucks or anything like that, their system strain isn't all that high.
No, it's shockingly low, actually.
Yeah, and they're not going to be able to repair it on the fly. If they're in a starfighter or something like that, sure, they might have the equivalent of an astromech droid, but it's not something that does happen as easily as you might think. So another question that I've been asked when it comes to this is, can you track the pursuit beyond extreme range?
When do you even need to do that, though?
Look, you don't. But if, for example, the PCs perhaps have shaken their pursuer and then failed to make a check to escape the city, you can always re-engage a chase and you just start all over again. So basically, you don't. As soon as they get to that, it's over. This is not an adversarial system. You're just telling a really good story. So as soon as they've reached that distance apart, it's over. They've managed to disappear into the shadows, or they've disappeared into traffic. Nobody knows where they are. But then it can be a skill challenge to get out of the city if that's what they're doing.
So, okay, we've talked about chases. Now, early on in the episode, or in this talk, we mentioned that we'd have a little bit of a side regarding race. Yeah. Because, yes, you can run races like chases, totally, regardless of how you choose to run a chase. But things are a little different, can be a little different with a race. And I think that's worth talking about because, chases can have multiple participants, but with races, it's actually extremely common. Okay. But, at a high degree, though, the chase rules are really designed to track the chased and the pursuer, regardless of how you're going about it, right? But with a race, it's a bit different. There's an end goal that is the finish line. That's the goal of the chase in a race. And honestly, you work out how long the race is, whether that be in rounds or in distance. Distance can really help if you want to use laps. I don't know about your players, Huli, but mine love to overtake their competitors. That is always a moment of cheering, sneering, and jeering at the table. So, handling it in distance it can easily be done. I love, because this is abstract and because this is narrative, you can run a race in rounds. I mean, you can absolutely do that. It's like, look, it's going to take 3 rounds narratively. How many successes are you going to pull out of your butt? I mean, that's that's really what it's going to come down to. But if you wanted to handle distance tracking, I don't know. There's several interesting ways that can be done if you want to be able to track it. I mean, obviously, there's encounter zones, like you mentioned before, right?
And, you could just basically use that to have the various vehicles move forward using their force movement towards a fixed point. If you want to do the math in your head quickly, you can basically say, well, these vehicles move this distance and, you take away so that you're not having to track this huge monstrous track. But I mean, that's another way that you can do it as well. You can actually lay out the track and put in specific zones or specific elements to the scene, especially if you're doing sort of like some sort of post-apocalyptic chase. If you've got something, what was that movie? Death Race, I think it was. With Jason Statham, I know that it was a remake, but still, that certain elements can come into the scene.
Death Race 2000 was the original from the 70s.
Right. But. Yes, that's the one. But then Ready Player One had a really good example of things getting in the way that made the race that little bit more extreme and things like that. So yeah. All right, so we've pretty much explained how to run a chase or a race. As we mentioned before, skill challenges are probably the best one to use to do a race, especially if you don't want to track sort of where people are and that sort of the pack is where things are all happening as far as like the lead pack, and that's what you're focusing on. Like in Days of Thunder, for example, which is just Top Gun on the ground, that it was all based around looking at what's going on with the lead pack. Sure, somebody might get kicked out of the race and they just become debris then, which is always fun. But
right.
But there are some pro tips when it comes to running a combat chase. So what's your first tip?
Well, this is me you're talking to, so focus on the narrative, focus on the action. That's what matters more than anything else. But I think just as equally important, if the chase is taking place as a part of a larger encounter with elements that include characters jumping between vehicles or shooting at those same vehicles, then darn it, run it as you would combat. I mean, we can with Genesys. We can. Yeah. The rules are that flexible. You know, you don't need a separate system to do this. Just run it as you would combat.
Exactly. And look, the introduction of force movement changed the very nature of vehicle combat.
Exactly.
You know, it takes it into account momentum, that it's the thing that keeps moving the vehicle forward. And the pilot doesn't need to dedicate a single maneuver like they do in Star Wars to drive. Instead, only a dangerous driving check forces the PC to spend an action. So if you want to, you don't like, and I was having this discussion recently, that a chase doesn't always need to be always dangerous driving. There is, Bond is a good example, any cop film that, whether it be on TV or film, that there is always the moment during the chase where the characters can banter. That says to me that there are slow moments in a chase because it might be a straight stretch of road with no traffic or light traffic or something that doesn't really challenge the players. And as we've said before, don't force players to roll unless there is something at stake. So if you've got a blank area of space where there isn't any problems, don't have your characters having to spend an action to just drive their car. Let them hang outside the window and blat off a few shots with their Uzi or whatever it is that they're using.
Yep.
You know, that's
you know, and you talk about dangerous driving. I've actually written a series of talents that I actually that will be they're going to be an upcoming product. I'm close to releasing.
Yep.
That I actually call shamelessly Leaf on the Wind.
Right.
And Leaf on the Wind is a ranked because I don't think there's enough driving or chasing or piloting talents, quite frankly.
Yep.
It's a ranked talent that starts at tier 1. Okay. And every rank, when you have to make a dangerous driving check, you can spend 2 personal strain to reduce the check by 1, the difficulty of the check by 1 per rank of Leaf on the Wind. Okay? But I also have an improved Leaf on the Wind, which is a tier 3, that if you reduce a dangerous driving check to simple, which is no difficulty, you don't have to make the check.
Right.
And, you know, I think in that instance, I like the talents. They're gonna remain in the product, but they were born from a need where I think GMs often feel the need to enforce dangerous driving when they really don't have to. Yeah.
Yep. And that's kind of what Genesys has done. It's meaning that, you keep on moving, and sure, you can turn corners and whatever else. But if it's something like you need to do a 180, or you need to make a very sharp turn, sure, if you're traveling at high speed, you're going to need to be making some sort of a dangerous driving check.
Yeah.
Without sort of going too much into it, Chris, but, system strain is something that other than the system strain that you take from critical injuries and some weapons, that's something that isn't utilized a lot. Most of the time that it's a vehicle combat is run, it's always going to be, your tires take a hit, take some system strain, because there is very limited. But you could allow your characters to be doing more by causing system strain to the vehicle rather than necessarily themselves. But,
absolutely,
that would sort of come in playtesting. But
other pro tips for the combat chase, okay?
Yeah.
In Star Wars chases, the main rule to apply is that the pilot cannot spend maneuvers to change their relative position.
Right.
Okay. Instead, they use the fly or the drive maneuver at the start of the round that doesn't need to apply to Genesys chases. It doesn't, because pilots can spend their maneuvers to perform reposition maneuver to move an additional range band or two. That's what force movement brings to the table, and why it makes it so much more dynamic, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Remember, though, as a reminder, we've said this before, spending, and as you alluded to, spending 2 maneuvers in that way causes strain to the pilot, but also system strain to the vehicle.
That's right.
Okay, so don't forget that.
Because vehicles, as we've mentioned in a previous episode, vehicles could only allow 1 pilot-only action and 1 pilot-only maneuver. As soon as you go beyond that with an additional maneuver, even if you're not doing an action, that you're doing a second maneuver. If you're not doing an action, you don't take 2 strain personally because you're just doing 2 pilot-only maneuvers. But the vehicle does. It can only do 1 maneuver, 1 action. So something to remember there. The system strain is something you're going to have to manage, and manage like there is no tomorrow. Because you will run out of it really quickly. Because a motorbike has got 4 or 5 or something ludicrously low like that. It's nuts. But anyway. But yeah, so as we mentioned, in Genesys, when pilots are forced to make a dangerous driving check, they cannot perform any other actions like shooting. Dangerous driving is an action, and so that action maneuver economy, it goes because they've got to do that. But that allows other players inside the vehicle, if you've got something that's got multiple participants in, that they can start to do things. And probably another pro tip, which isn't in the show notes though, is if you're running a race and it's like a pod race, or it's a motorcycle race, or a car race, make sure that the other players aren't just sitting there doing nothing. Give them one of the other participants in the race. Just give them stock standard stats. And if they survive, well, that's another recurring character. Even allow your players to name them. Players. It's a pretty much a given rule that players don't tend to want to backstab other players, but that feeling is sometimes there just for fun, just because tall poppy syndrome, whatever you want to call it. That give them the opportunity to do something nasty to another player. They'll take the opportunity, but the other thing is that they don't want that player to be annoyed at them. So they won't necessarily step over that line. As a GM, you can step over that line because you're the GM. You don't want that adversarial nature, but that's just part of the job when it comes to those sorts of situations, because the bad guys are motivated. But when it comes to it, that the players are going to ease back on the throttle, another pun as intended, is to not go that next stage where they're going to injure or have the main PC killed. But also make sure that we've all seen shows about races, especially in Formula One races and also your NASCAR, that you do have a pit crew. And sure, they only get used every so often to do, quick repairs, change tyres, whatever else. But they're also attached via a link, whether it be comlink or whatever, that allows them to talk to the other person. So assist can sometimes apply when it comes to those sorts of things as well. So allow for that. Mm-hmm. Any other hot pro tips, Chris?
When you are the party who is being chased, you can decide and remind your players of this as a GM. They can decide to drive dangerously. It doesn't have to be an obstacle you throw at them. How many films have you watched where the person being chased, drives through a shopping mall or through the sidewalk market in order to throw their pursuers?
Yeah.
Okay. allow that. That's totally cool. And when it happens, if the pursuer wishes to follow, they must also perform a dangerous driving action. And this is a great way for a stellar character who is a great pilot or a great driver to be able to easily make that check, whereas they're counting that their pursuer will not. All right. It's also a fantastic creative way to get out of a bind when you find yourself in a vehicle that is much less powerful or much slower than the vehicle chasing you.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have I had two of my OG gaming buddies. One of them, to this day, he still only drives these souped up rice rockets. Okay.
Right.
He just, dude, I mean, yeah, it's he street raced in like high school and early college and stuff, and all, he just drives these just kitted out, ridiculous, Japanese imports, right? That's all he drives.
Right.
And that's Larkin. Well, one of our other buddies, Russell, he kind of grew up as a good old boy, and all he would drive were these massive pickup trucks.
Right.
Okay. And they would get into these arguments, and this is making me think of this. It's just cracking me up because it would be like, he's like, the way stupid 20-year-olds do. It's like, my car could smoke yours, and things like that. And Russell would just be like, yeah, on the road. He's like, I'll race you anytime you want. Just I get to pick the track. Because your little rice rocket's going to bottom out in about 6 feet after the track I pick. And so that's a interesting way to illustrate a tactic that you can use when you're being chased.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, the shopping mall that you mentioned, Blues Brothers comes to mind. Yes. They go into that just because they can, and then you can throw in those, like we talked about before, you can throw in those other elements. Like, how many times has there been chases with a car and then someone's washing ends up on the windscreen of the car,
yes,
and things like that. So that's a really good pro tip that allow the players to change the environment if they want to go off-road. Because, police cruisers don't necessarily go very well in the urban jungle. The jungle, not the urban one. But yeah. So, yeah, really good option.
Okay, so Huli, I know this is a vehicle show. Yeah. And I know we're talking about vehicles, and we've talked about chases and races in vehicles. But what about other chases, man? What about foot chases? I mean, we're on the topic.
Yeah. Look, this is something that was mentioned by one of our Patreon listeners, that they really wanted to hear a little bit more about foot chases as well. You can run a foot chase in exactly the same way that you would any normal vehicle chase. The only difference is that the force movement doesn't really exist, so you have to spend maneuvers, but you're only spending maneuvers. If you need to make some sort of an action, so in the same sort of scenario that, if they want to get over a 6-foot chain wire fence, that they're going to have to use athletics. Or depending on the environment, they may be able to use coordination. Or depending on how long the chase has been going for, they can use resilience.
Resilience, yep.
But otherwise, it follows exactly the same process, that they spend maneuvers to move. The chances are that they're going to be taking some strain, or, they might decide to spend strain for a little bit, knowing that their pursuers probably can't catch up. And will, use the matrix again, that some of the cops that were running after Trinity at the start, the agent was being able to keep up because he was either a really powerful rival or a nemesis. But the cops, on the other hand, they're just minions, and they will run out of steam as they're spending that strain. Because when it comes to minions, they're spending their wounds effectively. Doesn't mean that they're dead at the end. It just means that they've, fallen away because they've tripped over something on the rooftop, and they get less and less as they keep going. And eventually, as per every trope that we've ever seen on film, is that the only ones that are left are the Nemesis and the PC. So the only issue that you have left is the fact that people have no forced movement. So in other words, like characters don't have forced movement as opposed to vehicles. So unless you're playing in like an Alien or a superhero campaign or something like that, where PCs or NPCs get to use third maneuvers in a round that can be a move maneuver, or even, for example, with Terranoth, with the cat folk, who have Fleet of Paw that gives them the means to perform a second maneuver without suffering strain, your pursuers are probably never going to catch up with their quarry. However, as I mentioned before, strain is where foot chasers will start to hurt, because it's a limited resource. Taking that second maneuver or shooting or doing something else is going to cause strain. And it's a resource that there is only a certain finite amount of. Foot chasers, as we mentioned before, will still have dangerous maneuvers that require an action. But they will also have plenty of rolling of advantages and triumphs that can be used to give you that extra movement at no cost. So that's an important rule to remember. 2 advantages or a triumph can be used to give you a second maneuver at no strain cost. And that's where you can make up the distance or allow the PC's target to disappear eventually, to pull away. And that's all you have to do. And there's no rules changes required. You just do everything as per what the stock standard rules are. It really is amazing the difference between the 2 systems of Star Wars versus Genesys. Now, again, you can, of course, run a foot chase as a competitive skill challenge. And when Chris and I finish our skill challenge supplement, we'll give you that in greater detail. But the short version is give the chase a target number. And that target number is going to be dependent on how long you want the chase to be. If you want the PCs to and NPCs to have a certain number that they have to achieve, you might want to make it a short chase. So you might say it's only 5. You want a longer chase, you might be making it 20. And that's 20 successes. That's uncancelled successes. So the first one to reach that wins. And they get to determine what the result of that was, whether it be that they lose sight of where the NPC is, but they manage to find out where the hideout is, or it can be that they manage to crash tackle the NPC at the last minute, and then they get to interrogate them or whatever. The aim here, though, would be that each roll. So remembering that you're doing these in groups of 3 or until you achieve that result, that each roll represents an element of the chase. So, for example, the first one might be running through an alley where you get attacked by a dog. The difficulty increases with threats and despairs, resulting in wounds to the PCs or the NPCs as they're attacked by the dog. And each of those scenes can be something completely different. Clearing a gap between rooftops, for example. And there's all sorts of other things that can happen, washing lines getting in the way or whatever. What about even running through a dungeon, for example, with undiscovered traps? And if you look at the start of Raiders of the Lost Ark, it's another good example with, all the arrows firing out of the slits in the wall, while Indy runs from the collapsing temple. Chris mentioned before about the chase without an enemy, but the circumstances that you're running away from. And that's another reason. That's another place that a random encounter table could come in really handy. Even the chase cards I mentioned with Paizo, or that idea I talked about with using playing cards as well. So, heaps of options there. But are there other options?
Yeah, I wanted to bring this up
Right.
Like, we've talked about all this. I want to close. I couldn't close out this segment without talking about some radical methods to handle a chase or a race.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. There's a few things that I have personally, I have never run it this way, but I have been a player in for various systems, going all the way back to 3rd edition Dungeons and Dragons. Okay.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Various different games, various different systems. Your party may not like this, so judge your players accordingly. But there is absolutely nothing that says you have to resolve a race or a chase using the dice. There are some pretty wild methods that I have been a party to and that I've seen that have been done. Yeah. And interestingly, fittingly, they all revolve around manual dexterity.
Right.
So, are you familiar with a game called Pitch Car?
I am not.
You need to look up Pitch Car. It's Are you familiar with crokinole or carom? Where you're flicking discs.
Oh yeah,
across
yeah.
Okay. Imagine that same mechanic, except a huge modular track that you can build, and you're literally flicking discs in a race. Okay.
Right. Yep.
And this is what it was actually Dave who did this. For a game he was running. And this is, before the narrative dice system was even a gleam in J Little's eye. He pulled out, because he loves Pitch Car, he pulled out Pitch Car, and he had actually glued, like, paper cutouts. It was a Star Wars game. He'd glued paper cutouts of, like, TIE fighters on some of them, and then our ships on the other. And we literally, of these little flicking tokens, and we literally played a game of Pitch Car to resolve the chase. Okay.
Right.
That was insane fun and just a great memory. Not something I would certainly do often, mostly because it also took an hour to resolve the game of Pitch Car, but we didn't care. We were having a great time. Another thing that I can recommend for something really weird, if it suits your weird bubble and you're weird like me, Jenga.
Yes. What is the game that uses Jenga? I know that Katrina Ostrom goes on about Dread.
It's called Dread.
Yeah.
Yeah,
she's always talking about that.
It's much the same concept, whereas Dread uses a Jenga tower to represent tension building, okay? In a very tactile and real sense of the table. For tense chase scenes, you can do the exact same thing here, where you could have it where opposing parties simply have to pull a block and place it, okay? Or if you want to involve the dice, especially with the narrative dice system, maybe the number of successes on your check, or better yet, I love this, not successes, the number of threat, okay, that you generate results in a number of blocks that you have to pull in place. Okay? And if you topple the Jenga tower, you're crashed, or you're out of the race, or you're out of the chase, or whatever it is. Now, I read about this next method. I have not seen it in play, but I'm familiar with the concept. There is a game, I think Cobweb Studios published it. It's called Hell for Leather. Okay,
right.
And its inspiration is do you ever see the Running Man with Arnold Schwarzenegger?
Oh, yes.
Okay. So it's like not too distant future where criminals are put into this crazy game show where they're hunted to death, right?
Right.
That's the premise of Hell for Leather, okay? But the resolution mechanic, as you go through scenes, you take there's a piece of paper that has these special areas printed out on it, and you literally tape it to the table. And in the center of the piece of paper, a tower of dice is stacked. Okay?
Right.
A tower of 6-sided dice gets continually stacked. And as the heat on the PCs grows, that tower gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger.
Right.
Surrounding that tower on the piece of paper, because the tower is in the dead center of the piece of paper, are these target areas. And to resolve, you have to literally take a die, it uses D10s, and you have to, like, from outside the paper, like carom style, you have to flick them onto the paper, and they have to not only roll well, but land in a certain area of the target. Okay.
Right.
And if you knock over the dice tower, horrible things happen. Okay. So I was reading about this where a game master was inspired by Hell for Leather, and he did this in Star Wars.
Right.
Took basically every time it was basically a weird skill challenge for a chase or a race. and every time somebody made a roll, the number of successes they would generate would determine, and the guy had a huge pile of dice, right? Of narrative dice. The number of successes they generated would determine the shape of the die they would have to add to the tower. Okay, so if you generated a lot of successes, you would add like a boost. You'd add a D6. You would just grab a boost die and add it to the tower. Okay, if you generated a moderate amount of successes, you would grab, I think it was a D12. Okay,
right,
and then for really awful or barely succeeded. You would add like a D8, okay? And the tower got higher and higher and higher. And again, if the tower falls, you crash, you're out in your placement, right?
Yep.
I mean, anyway, these are just weird, random things you can do, So let your gaming freak flag fly. And get creative if you absolutely want to. There's, despite all the things we told you, there's nothing saying you have to do this through standard dice mechanics.
Yeah, that's true. And if anybody is looking for Hell for Leather, there is actually a PDF version on Drive-Thru RPG that you can take a look at as well. So,
it's totally great, man. I've only gotten it on the table twice, and we had so much fun.
Yeah, that looks amazing. We'll have to check that out. That's great.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, you should check it out. It's really good. Awesome. Well, Huli.
Yep.
This has been a great discussion.
It has.
But I think it's time that we head back into one of my favorite segments, because do we or do we not have an excellent guest waiting in the wings?
Oh, yes, we do. Well, I do believe that you may be talking about Breaking the Mould for a start, and I'm also quite excited to be talking to our guest.
Well, dude, let's break that mold, yeah?
Yeah, if you insist.
Breaking the Mould.
The Genesys Foundry is an exciting community of fan-created content for Genesys. New settings, new rules options, adventure and campaign modules, and much more. But some creators go above and beyond, subverting our expectations and breaking the mold with their work. Our Breaking the Mold segment is dedicated to showcasing an exciting offering available right now on the Genesys Foundry as we separate the pure alloy from the slag, and we point you to the best content out there.
Now, tonight's guest is the creative mind behind one of the more useful items recently released on the Foundry right now. A new tool set for critical hits that expands the narrative for any game group in any setting. And I had the privilege of also working on this product in terms of, the graphic design and layout as well. And that product is the recently released Genesys Expanded Critical Injury Tables by community fixture Roy Altman, aka RPG Narco.
Expanded Critical Tables is a very meaty and meaningful resource that takes the traditional critical hit table for personal combat and it expands it into 6 optional additions that are tailored to the type of weapon or attack that are used to create the hit and the crit, from things that crush, puncture, and slash to those that freeze, zap, and burn. A host of new creative options available to spice up your games with this supplement. And with that, we were really eager to talk about it. So to that end, Roy, welcome to the show, man.
Hi, what's up? So excited to be here.
So, Roy, it's really good to have you on. Obviously, our listeners are hearing you for the first time, but and we're here to talk about Expanded Critical Tables. But before we do that, we would love to get to know you better. Maybe you can take some time to tell us a little bit about yourself and your gaming career.
So I'm 44 years old. I live in Tel Aviv, Israel, with my wife and 2 sons. And during the day, I'm actually a self-employed VFX artist and animator. You can see my portfolio on royaltman.net.
Cool.
Ooh.
Yeah, thanks. But I've been a gamer pretty much all my life. I have dozens of board games and role-playing games and video games, everything really, but not any sports. So.
Yeah, you're in good company there, man.
Okay, anyway, I started playing Dungeons & Dragons in 1987 with the 2 red, the red box, the original red box. Yeah. And my mind was blown, actually. I didn't get it in the beginning. I couldn't figure it out. But once I started the first session, 10 minutes into it, I said, okay, I can do this for the rest of my life. My first character died 10 minutes into my first session, but it was in yeah. First combat, I just jumped into it. Didn't know what was going to happen. Anyway, after the first session, I told the dungeon master then that I'm going to be the dungeon master from now on. And I'm also immediately started working on my own Dungeons & Dragons character sheet design. And I've been playing pretty much since then, constantly. Mostly in a bunch of systems, mostly Rollmaster and Warhammer. And for the last 2 years almost, we've been playing Genesys. And no matter the system, I was always ending up designing character sheets and player aids for my group. I recently started a website called RPGNarco.com for all my RPG stuff that I created over the years. There are a lot of Genesys resources there also.
It's a great site. You guys should check it out. There's a lot of really cool, fun stuff there.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the cards, Roy. The cards are just absolutely fantastic. So yeah, very, very worth it. Now, also, as we ask all of our guests, what style of game, and you've already mentioned some of them that you really got stuck into, but, what style of game or game setting or theme do you like to get on the table when you play? In other words, what's your favorite thing to play in Genesys?
Right now, I would say it's epic high fantasy, or epic anything, really. Stuff with, stuff with high production value, explosions and planets collapsing and really stuff that you need at least $300 million to make it. At least. It wasn't always my taste. I used to have much smaller adventures, where the party was really busy with trying to survive all the time. Mm. And Genesys is what opened up, I think, this epic part of me, because it's very easy to have a high production value story right from the beginning. Mm. The players are very powerful, especially with the story points where you can just decide you can change the narrative, on a whim. Mm. And hey, you got to despair, great, the building explodes. Just think how much number crunching and dice rolling would involve in spontaneously blowing up a building in any other system. Really.
Oh, God.
So this game just lends itself into epic cool things happening in almost every die roll, really. Because, anything can happen. Right now we're playing in the Salvage World setting. You can get it on the Foundry also. And it's really, really, the whole group just fell in love with it, and we're having a blast playing it. And we're also keeping it epic with world-changing consequences and stuff.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah. Salvage is so great. We obviously had Jared on the show a little while ago to talk about it. And yeah, it's one of the most exciting things I've seen to come out of the Foundry in a very long time.
Yeah, it's really, really evocative and,
Yeah, that's a great way to describe it. It's very evocative. But speaking of being evocative, because, meaning it drives me to want to do things, I want to talk about expanded critical tables.
Yes.
Because I found it to be very evocative, even from what is purely a mechanical supplement, which is really what I think intrigued me the most about it. Is it's very rare that I read a mechanical supplement, I'm like, I have to start using this immediately. Okay, so. And I felt that way. So give us the pitch, Roy. I mean, Expanded Critical Tables is currently in the top 10 hottest titles on the Foundry. So tell us about it. How would you describe it to someone who's looking to purchase it? What makes it different from other supplement, and generally speaking, what content can players expect to find in it?
It just got also the Copper Sales Award yesterday, by the way.
Hey, congratulations.
Congrats.
Thanks. That's just less than 3 weeks after I published it, so
wow,
it's like the fastest of my products got it. And by the way, this is all thanks to the Genesys player community for sure. I would never have dreamed of publishing anything without the great inspiration and encouragement I got from the community, especially the Genesys Facebook group.
Yeah. It's an amazing group.
Yeah. Okay. So what this book is about, I guess the title says it all, right? It's the Expanded Critical Tables for Genesys. I try to think up another more evocative or provocative name, like In Agonizing Pain, or the Genesys Greatest Hits. Yeah, that was a friend of mine's idea. It was a good one. And Huli had some great ideas, but this project was really more than 6 months under development. So I didn't want to delay anymore and just put it out.
Yeah.
Okay, so like I said, the title says it all. This supplement gives you 6 new critical injury tables, 1 for each attack type. There are all in all 149 new critical injury descriptions. That includes the narrative description and the mechanical description, obviously.
Wow.
And the goal of these tables is to make combat much more dynamic, much more unpredictable, and, harder for the player characters, that's for sure.
It's absolutely... Some of the descriptions are just... Because the involvement that I had was very minor in the big scope of things. The amount of work that had obviously gone on before I was ever involved, it blew me away, all of the content in there. It's as Chris said, it's the sort of thing that I've printed out now and I'll be using for my sessions. It's great. Now, Roy, what can you tell us about, obviously I had a bit of involvement with it, but tell us about the development and design of Expanded Critical Tables. How was it born? Where did the idea stem from? And what did the development process look like from, start to finish?
Well, our group used to play Rollmaster for well over a decade. So critical tables are in our blood. No pun intended. Yeah. And so we had to stop playing Rollmaster because we just started to have lives all of a sudden. We can't have a 3-week character creation process and 6-hour combat sessions. Rollmaster is just very high maintenance.
Yeah.
And so when I first read the Genesys core book and saw the critical table, I just said to myself, well, man, this could be perfect if it was expanded to more tables like Rollmaster has. Not so many tables, because...
They don't call it Table Master for nothing.
But a few more will be perfect, exactly what they did. And this was long before I even knew the Foundry ever existed. It's just because our group likes them. So I started working on it more than 6 months ago. I can tell you that the last critical descriptions were the hardest to come up with. I used to have moments like in the middle of the night shouting, "Yes, chopped knee," and then run to add it to the list. Yeah, it really took a long time, both to come up with the descriptions and the mechanical effects, because there are a lot of already made talents and all sorts of mechanical effects throughout the books, and I wanted to make it original. So yeah, it was fun. It was hard. It took a long time, especially the balancing part. Yeah.
And with being a Rollmaster veteran, it's like it's a Rollmaster play. Is like, well, how's your character doing today? My character is doing okay.
No, that was just the first roll out of 6 tables. You need to figure out. Yeah, doing okay.
Yeah, that's right. You need 3 rolls to figure that out. That's it. But Roy, when you talk about that tough development process, I want to expand on that, because when you're dealing with a supplement like this, and when it deals with combat mechanics specifically, which is really when this is going to crop up, that process of design, but more importantly, testing, can be incredibly daunting. I mean, what can you tell us about the play testing process for this? You said this was 6 months in development.
Yeah.
What did that play testing process look like?
Well, I can tell you my players are permanently traumatized. That's for sure.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, there were several times in the middle of a session when the character got hit and I read out one of my new critical descriptions,
right?
And everybody's jaw just dropped to the table because it was too tough. Yeah, obviously. So they really helped me out. They were a great help in balancing out the results. All my players are really munchkin rule lawyers, and they love to min-max. All that's the horrible things game masters don't like. But they're also great role players. Anyway, anytime something wasn't balanced, they made sure I knew it, even if it was against them. Actually, there was this combat against this huge Hydra, and in the second round, one of the players rolled not that high a critical, and the description was so devastating that it pretty much ended the combat right there and there. And they told me about it. They thought, wait, that's too powerful. Just delete it, change it. We used the original table for that exact critical and that exact combat. But so you can see even if it was against them, they were really helpful. And I also consulted with some of the great minds of the Genesys community. Several people really were helpful, super helpful. They spent a lot of time going through the critical tables one by one and discussing it with me. So it's really a great community, I told you.
It is a phenomenal community.
Yeah, really, people really invested time in it. I mean, like hours. Except for Huli was amazing, yeah, for sure.
It was a lot of fun though. Like I can't even remember how I got involved. I think that I was just talking to you online about it. Like the one thing that I think that my input definitely had an impact on was to make each of the charts their own chart, because the writing, when you're fitting in that much text, the writing, I don't know what point form we had, but it was really small. So to go and take it and expand it to those additional tables does make it a lot more accessible to everyone. And so I'm glad that you took that on board, and we did a bit of that. And I learned a few more things about tables in InDesign as well in the process. So that was a lot of fun.
I can tell you that the font, after all, my inspiration was Rollmaster. So the font size in the Rollmaster tables is even smaller. Just so you know. Yeah.
Wow. I think I need some sort of magnifying glass or something to be able to be reading the tables then. It's been a long time since I played Rollmaster.
But that's true. Maybe it's something we should emphasize, that the tables in the book are but organized in two separate styles. One in a single page with small font, and another style is across 6 pages with much larger font for people in our age group.
Yes, that's the polite way of saying it.
For us old men.
Yes, exactly. Now, Roy, can you give us a bit of a glimpse of something exciting or unique in the expanded critical tables? Maybe to whet our appetite for those who haven't gone and purchased the product, and perhaps also share with us, your favorite thing that is in the supplement.
I think my favorite thing is that it doesn't cost any time to implement it, to integrate it into your sessions. It doesn't change any rules. It doesn't change any math or statistics. You just replace the original general critical table with one of the extension critical tables according to your weapon type, your attack type. So I think that's my favorite thing, that it doesn't really burden the game in any way, or just seamlessly integrate it into any group. Doesn't matter the genre or the setting. It should be easily integrated. That's my favorite thing. Would you like it to read out like specific critical injuries?
Dude,
Sure.
yeah. I wanted to ask you both this actually. You got 149 descriptive entries in here.
Yeah.
But I want to ask both of you, because you were both involved in this. What is your favorite crit in there, and let us know what table it's in as well.
Roy, you go first.
Yeah. Okay. I think my favorite criticals and the ones that were easiest to write are the higher number ones, the kill ones, because the descriptions are just, I tried to make them as let's say hurtful as possible. I wanted the players to say, "Oh," you know what I mean. I can give you an example, just a second, and open it up. I wanted really combat to be, it is memorable, I remember all the combats we had in Genesys, because it's all very descriptive, you know what I mean? It's all very narrative. It's not just, okay, you roll, you hit for 8 hit points or whatever. So all the combat in Genesys is already very narrative and very memorable, but I wanted to make it even a bit more. Here, I'll open up the tables. Because that's what happened when we played Rollmaster. Well, I have combats that we played, like 20 years ago that I still remember because of the specific critical, something like that. Well, for example, from the electricity critical table, which can be applied to all kinds of attack types, from lightning bolts to futuristic weapons, to even a magic missile, I think, can be in the electricity critical table. Yeah, like this one. If you get 131 to 140 in the electricity table, it says, target's nervous system acts as a superconductor. Foe suffers 2 wounds and 1 strain at the start of their turn. Anyone touching the target also suffers 1 wound. You can see it's going to be difficult to heal this person, for example. I'll give you another example from another table.
I'll tell you what my favorite is, and that's in the slashing table, which is 81 to 85. I love it because of the name, which is, that's a lot of blood. And its target suffers 2 wounds and must upgrade the difficulty of all checks by 1 until the end of the encounter. That's brutal.
God, what did you say? What's the critical number? What do you have to roll to get that?
81 to 85.
Oh, that's worth 81 to 85.
Yeah,
okay,
absolutely. But
Okay, great. Yeah. The combat is tough. I have to say that this will make for sure combat tougher on the player characters mostly because they're the ones who have to carry the critical results with them. Adversaries usually don't have the combat standing up anyway.
Right.
So yeah, it's gonna be tougher. But my players loved it. My players loved the challenge.
I have to say, I've heard many players complain about the crit table. Like I love the concept. It's not varied enough, or the crit doesn't necessarily apply to me, or doesn't affect me in any meaningful way.
Right.
And so this is certainly an option for that, I guess. But I'm thrilled. I can't wait to start using this right away. But it's been very interesting to read, and I can't recommend it enough to all of you. But I guess really the last thing to talk about, Roy, and the last question for you is, what's next for you and the Foundry? You're seeing some strong early success with this product. What can we expect from RPG Narco on the Foundry in the future?
So I'm working on several things right now. I have a 5-year plan for the Foundry. But, you can't really tell how the world will look in 2 months from now. So 5 years is not a good time frame. But I can tell you what I'm working on anyway. I'm doing something with a new thing with Chris Markham. I'm drawing some maps for a new supplement he's working on.
Cool.
And I'm also working on a Keyforge style adversary card template.
Nice.
I already have Shadow of the Beanstalk, and so a Keyforge is just the logical next step. And I'm working on a Genesys digital character app, and Huli gave me the idea to make an expanded vehicle critical table supplement.
Yes, please.
So that's on the table. And I'm working on the Photoshop plugin that will allow complete newbies to draw beautiful RPG maps, like the ones I made for Chris Markham's supplements.
Right.
Wow.
So a lot of my plate, yeah. A lot of my plate.
I can imagine.
I usually update RPGNarco.com with every the new stuff I'm working on, so be sure to check it out. A lot of free stuff there.
If you come out with a mobile-friendly app for a Genesys character sheet, a digital character sheet, you will be my hero.
It's halfway done. I just need like a couple of months, really.
Wow.
It's amazing. It's earth-shattering. I'm not kidding.
Oh, man. Well, maybe we can have you on the show again to talk about that, because, that's not even a Foundry product. That's just amazing.
We'll see. We'll see how it turns out, yeah.
Oh, wow. That's wonderful. God, well, Roy, I want to thank you for taking the time to come on and talk with us about this. It's a phenomenal product. If you guys haven't checked out Expanded Critical Tables, and getting to bronze in just a couple weeks, I think a lot of you are. But if you haven't checked out Expanded Critical Tables on the Foundry yet, you really need to.
Yep.
It's something that I feel will add, from my opinion, will add a tremendous amount to your game, regardless of what type of game you're running. And I think that's the real strength here. This is a new mechanical avenue that, as Roy said, takes nothing to bring into your games, no real changes on your part, outside of just rolling on a new table, and it will work for any setting. And I think that's something really unusual and very unique. So check it out if you haven't already. Roy, thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you, guys. I also want to say that I just love your show. I listen to it all the time, and it's really... I'm almost sorry that you took down from 4 hours to 2 hours, because it's just to spend my whole week with you guys. So, just in the background. So it's really fun to finally talk with you.
Well, we're glad to have you on.
Yeah.
We are very glad to have you on.
Yeah.
And speaking of glad, Hooli, I am glad to potentially get to a few questions. Do you think maybe we should slide our way under that hammer?
I think we should.
Under the Hammer.
And welcome to Under the Hammer, the segment where we answer your games and rules questions about the Genesys role-playing game as it impacts both rules, content creation and play. And we've got some great questions this week. Of course, if you would like to join and get your questions to run to the top of the queue, just visit patreon.com/Forge Genesys and become a Tier 2 supporter today. All right, Chris, what's our first question?
Interesting one. It comes from GM Ty via our Discord. Who said the following. He says, I'm working on, and he actually posted a huge thing about this, and we great, again, the earlier in the show, you were talking about the great conversation happening over there. Some fantastic conversation between him and I and Fat Crab and a few others, really going back and forth about it. But he basically, he's working on a Kids on Bikes style mystery adventure that's set in the world of Android.
That's so cool.
I know, right? He says, think cyberpunk Stranger Things.
Right.
His question is, how would you go about creating or converting archetypes, or for that matter, careers, for kids and teens of various economic classes in the Android setting? I'm a bit stumped on this.
Interesting. I have some thoughts.
I do too. I gave him a lot of info, but I mean, at least my opinion.
Sure.
Hotly debated.
What's your thoughts?
Well, look, it's first of all, this is a massively broad question, Hooli. We could do an entire show about creating such archetypes and careers, quite frankly. So I want to try and be as concise as I can, here and under the hammer. But I do think there's a few nuggets of advice that I think we can give when it comes to creating kids or preteens or teens as archetypes in the setting that he's suggesting.
Yep.
First of all, start with your skill list, Ty. It's very easy to say, use the Android skill list from Shadow of the Beanstalk. But you got to ask yourself if that's actually the case. If you're truly going for a Kids on Bikes or Stranger Things, there's a lot of skills, combat skills especially, they're going to be pretty rare for such characters. To borrow and paraphrase a piece of advice from DM Eric on our last show, Hooli, create a skill list that matches to your campaign. That is much more important than matching it to the setting. Okay? And the reason I bring that up is because that skill list is honestly more important than the archetypes or even the careers. Not the least of which is because it informs both archetypes to a degree and careers to a strong degree. All right? My second piece of advice was to, I think you create archetypes or careers based off of roles that such kids would have in a typical adventure in this world. If you think about Kids on Bikes or Stranger Things, the characters fall into these roles or archetypes that correspond to those stories that harken back to the 80s movies that we grew up with. The Breakfast Club is the perfect example. You have the nerdy kid, you have the jock, you have the popular one, you have the delinquent, and you have the weirdo. Okay?
Right. Yep.
And those all correspond to, and those are roles you'll find in virtually every teenage or preteen 80s movie, period.
Yep.
Okay? And all those classic roles, they correspond to classic roles in an RPG when you really think about it. Okay?
Yep.
You have to decide, Ty, if you want those represented by archetypes or by careers or by both. If it's something that you're inherently good at, like you're naturally stronger or faster or smarter, then archetype is where you want to start. If it's something that you learn or improve over time, for example, skill ranks, then careers is where you want to go for those role-based distinctions. And in many cases, it's both, which is why players pick species and archetypes that min-max well with certain careers.
Right.
And I did have one other piece of advice that I did want to drop regarding XP for archetype creation. But before I do that, I mean, Huli, what are your thoughts on what I've said and your own notions?
Well, look, you're 100% right, and we're definitely on the same page there, that's for sure. The thing that sort of... One of the issues that was raised by somebody else was that this particular genre, that the kids are supposed to be better than the adults. That all of the adults, especially if you look at the likes of Goonies, for example, that all the kids are, yeah, sure, they're kids, but their skills are much, much better than the NPCs or the adults in the story. And so I think it was Fat Crab basically mentioned that by having them having the kids better, that obviously means that they're going to have better skill. They're going to have more access to skills. They're going to have more XP. They're going to have better abilities. But I don't know whether I subscribe to that idea at all.
I don't.
And I'll go back to your setting, Chris, with Familiar. The genre is that you're all small animals. Does that need, if you've got an archetype that you're using or a species, does that need to be able to be transferable directly into Android Shadow the Beanstalk? The answer to that is no. The same process happens if you've got a superhero RPG. The Genesys core rules say that it should have another 50 XP on top to be able to spend on statistics. So that doesn't really correlate or balance with Realms of Terranoth. A Realms of Terranoth character has, they've got heroic abilities, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to translate over into a Shadow the Beanstalk setting, because those characters don't. All of these little bits and pieces fit into that particular setting. They don't necessarily translate into another setting. And this is where you say that you've got to, from what Eric said, and I'm going to reiterate it, is that, you create this skill list to match your campaign. And that's more important than matching to the setting. Because the campaign could be completely different, but still in Shadow the Beanstalk campaign, like what Ty's done for this, is that the characters only need to suit your campaign. They don't need to fit into somebody else's campaign. So that's my thoughts.
So I completely agree. As far as some tricks to actually building archetypes for preteens or children, I mean, I think Ty or any other GM who's doing this needs to consider the ultimate question that I think in our discussion Fat Crab really went into, which is, do you want these characters to be as competent as adults or not? Okay. I would argue that those 80s films that we love so much, you regularly see those children trounce adults, but you also see them constantly get beaten by adults. They're constantly captured. Okay.
Yep.
They're constantly discovered. They get by based on wit and luck. All right. Which means creative player choices and, quite frankly, story points. And archetype abilities that can be driven by story points that that regular archetypes would have. Something like the common abilities to, like, you're a child, so your strength score is obviously, your strength characteristic is your brawn is not going to be as much as an adult. Okay, that's likely. Okay, for most young people. However, maybe your archetype has a special ability that you can drop a story point and you can substitute your cunning for your brawn characteristic on a skill check, right? Those are the kinds of abilities that normal adult NPCs don't have access to in this setting, and it's what allows a teen or preteen to occasionally trounce them while still maintaining that feel. And consequently, this means that adult heroes in that setting are going to have those abilities as well. But it's one of those things. It's not so much are the kids or preteens in such a set in your setting going to be as powerful as NPC adults? The question is, are they going to be as powerful as PC adults? Okay.
Yeah.
And if they are, why are you making them kids or preteens? What's the point there? So with all that underway, my last piece of advice was, I think one of the things that's the easiest way to represent this for an underpowered, for lack of a better term, character is to reduce starting XP. And I'm not I'm talking about the XP that you use to build the archetype from the ground up. Okay. And we've had several episodes of this. Removing 20 to 30 XP from the standard totals, it does a remarkable job. It ensures that the characteristics are going to be a little less than the average adult, and or you're just not going to have as much to start with when it comes to skill ranks. Other great suggestions, even though you can have like a high schooler kid who's a buff dude, who's a star athlete, he's probably not going to have a brawn or an agility more than 3. Okay.
Yeah.
Outside of the occasional genius savant, even the nerdiest kid at the school is probably not going to have an intellect more than 3. Okay. So, which is still very high. It's well above average. Okay. So you may want to limit characteristics to 3 at character creation is another thing I would suggest. Or potentially limit the free ranks they get from career skills. That's another option. Instead of getting 4 free ranks, maybe they get 3. Okay. Or maybe even 2 if you really want to nerf.
Yep.
The other thing that was recommended, and I think this is another interesting idea, is if you really want to represent that these are kids who are physically and experientially much less powerful than an adult. Their characteristics are going to be lower. Their skill ranks are going to be lower because they're kids. Their starting XP is going to be lower because they're kids. They don't have the life experience yet. But you still want them to be able to give it to adults as good as they get. From an archetype creation standpoint, we had a great suggestion that I would echo. Create an archetype with an extra special ability that is just unique to a kid. And that special ability should be something of the equivalent of, once an encounter or once a session, you can throw some boost dice onto some rolls.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. That just represents the youthful vigor or the luck of youth, right?
Right.
Because that represents you being, generally speaking, much less competent than an adult in a dice pool, but being able to pull a major dice pool out of your behind and make it when you need to, because you're the plucky, youthful hero, basically. So,
yep.
I don't know. Those are some general suggestions I've got. I hope they're somewhat helpful.
One of the things that I think is by dropping it by that 20 to 30 XP, that players are probably going to still have a 1 in something.
Oh, totally.
And that can make a big, big difference to, even if they've got, if some kid, part of their backstory is that they're a martial arts champion, but they're only like 10 years of age, that they may only have a strength of 1. But they also might have 2 ranks in Brawl, which means that they're going to be still, because of the way that the dice mechanic works, they'll be using 2 greens upgraded once, which is still pretty good for a kid of 10. They're going to be able to do some damage to a minion at the very least. I think that's great advice.
Yeah. But don't your players will surprise you. And, you go back to familiar, Hooli, my setting on my setting for familiar. Yep. When I created those familiar archetypes, all of them have 3 1s and 3 2s in their characteristics. Yep. Okay. And their starting XP is only 50 or 60. Okay. So I cut the XP by about 60 from, 60, 65, 70 in some cases. Actually 70, if you really want to, you consider the fact that you brought down a 3 and brought down another 1. I cut a lot of XP from those archetypes in terms of the build. And, because these archetypes were intended to be intentionally underpowered. That's the fun. That's the point, right?
Yeah.
And
right.
Dude, these players playing that setting They trounce the heck out of things. It's insane, right? Never underestimate player creativity and story points. It's amazing what they can do.
Yeah.
It's amazing what they can. It's absolutely amazing. Because even with low characteristics and low XP, they're, like you said, they're probably going to have a 1 in something, Hooli, no doubt. They're probably going to have a 3 in something too. Okay?
Sure.
And you know as well as I do that 3 dice in a pool is that magical threshold.
Yeah.
When you get to 3 dice in a pool, you have a very strong chance of succeeding. I mean, very strong. Okay?
Yep.
So, I mean, yeah.
Very interesting, very topical question, I think, with people designing their own archetypes for their settings. Sometimes think outside the box is my advice when it comes to that. So yeah, really good. Our next question comes in via Facebook from the Genesys RPG community group, which you should all be members of if you're not already. And we thought it was a great one. Now it's from Nis. I'm terrible with names.
But this is a Nish Klosgard, I think.
Right. Okay. Sorry if that's not how it's pronounced. But Nish says, so familiars. Maybe my memory or Google skills are lacking, but I don't seem to recall any rules or talents for familiars for magic users. Guess it would be an easy rework of the animal companion talent if you want to have it like 5th edition D&D, but I really want something closer to real folklore familiars, a creature companion that assists with magic. You know, black cats, toads, etc. Sprites, pixies even. I'm thinking something like sharing the stress costs of magic with the familiar. That would be the simplest thing. Or let the familiar take strain damage to give the caster a boost die, or upgrade the dice roll depending on the strain paid, or maybe gain a free advantage for paid strain. More complicated, but maybe you could get to add an effect to your casting using the familiar. I'm just spitballing here.
Well, Nish, I'm just spitballing here, but although I wrote a setting on the Foundry called Familiar that is about playing a familiar as a PC, there is nothing stopping you from using those rules and that setting to create an NPC familiar, just a starting beginner character. And I think you would find them to be well costed. And then at that point, it's not like 5th edition D&D at all. It's an actual NPC that follows you around. They have a form of sentience. They can communicate with you. They can cast a spell of their own. And then more importantly, they have their own skills and their own dice pools, and they can assist you on checks. So, which is really what you're describing if you really want a creature companion that assists with magic in that way.
Yeah.
You know, but what if you don't want that? What if you want to create something out of whole cloth, or you want to go a different route?
So what do you do? Look, I mean, obviously you've got a lot more experience in the magic department. There's no official published rules or talents for familiar animals that provide any difference from the standard animal companion talent.
No.
And look, I think we've got some suggestions to make this happen. First of all, I'd make a talent, but it could be either a rework of Animal Companion, still at Tier 3, or it could be a Tier 4 talent that has Animal Companion as a prerequisite. There's really several paths that you can take, but if it's a Tier 4 talent, I would give the familiar slightly better benefits than the animal companion you get at Tier 3.
Well, yeah, I even if you get a magical familiar at Tier 3, I would give it worse benefits than if the magical companion talent was at Tier 4.
So what would those benefits be? How would it work? Well, we've kind of got some suggestions because obviously we've had this question for a little bit. Now, the idea of a familiar taking your strain for magic, it's a good one. But honestly, you don't want to be tracking your familiar strain threshold as well as your own. It's too much extra bookkeeping, and I think we've mentioned that numerous times before. And it's also prone to abuse. Not that you would have that, not that you can say that about every player, but certainly there are going to be players that, for whatever reason, they make a mistake. But you can easily say once per session, when engaged with your familiar, you may cast a spell without suffering the normal 2 strain spellcasting cost. If the talent is tier 3, you could even make that cost a story point, but I think I'd keep it story point free if it's tier 4.
Yeah, I agree.
Another option would be boost die, as Chris mentioned before. But again, for the sake of easiness, I'd make it a once per session ability as we previously mentioned. As for boost die, though I wouldn't do this for ignoring strain, you could even add an improved version of the talent that allows the ability once per encounter instead.
That's a really good idea. And what a powerful tier 5 talent that would be.
Now, I would caution against adding additional effects to spells, though, because at that point, your familiar is just another implement.
Yeah.
Which you don't want your familiar to just be a piece of equipment that, Order of the Stick did numerous pokes at that sort of thing where you basically just, there's my, what was it, a crow familiar.
Yeah, yes, it's Raven. Yes, yes, it's absolutely. Now, of course, Uli, you say that.
Yeah,
they could want to do it that way, and that's actually another thing you could consider. I wouldn't necessarily, role play it this way, but you could actually, and another easy way to handle this without talents would be to create a brand new implement type of familiar.
That's a great suggestion.
And then you can treat it and cost it like any other implement. So at that point, it provides the benefits that implements would, depending on the cost of the familiar, how powerful it is, what it does for you. You could even create, different species could even offer different capabilities.
Yeah.
And then, that could be really interesting. And then you could you still have the same rule. You can only use one implement at a time, right?
Right.
It's just, you got your familiar. I don't know. I think that's a very interesting idea.
That's a really, really cool idea. And you could even sort of go down the path of there would be some talents that you could apply to your implement if you wanted to go, so that there's an XP cost that it could do extra things. And then you could sort of rework the animal companion talent so that you can increase its size, so that you can really be a familiar specialist. Your other option is to have them as attachments, but there may be an XP cost. I don't necessarily like that idea because it's moving XP away from the talents as well as skills. There's a couple of options there that you can improve things with, and I think that's something that hasn't really been messed with too much. Is the ability to, or abilities and talents that really start to mess with the implements themselves. You want to have someone. There's a I can't remember what system it's in, but you've got someone who specializes in wand use.
The wand slinger.
Yes, that's it. What systems is that? Is that Pathfinder? I can't remember.
Anyway. Actually, it was. I first saw it, I think, in Eberron.
Okay.
In D&D 3.5 Eberron, I think it was a feat, or it may have been an artificer or a rogue class ability. But if I'm remembering correctly, I could be totally wrong. Eric is probably screaming at me through the speaker right now. But yeah, I'd love to see someone do something like a wand slinger, right? Where you can do weird things with implements. I mean, what a fun concept that might be. So yeah. But listen, I hope these suggestions have been somewhat helpful. There's a lot of interesting ones out there. But I do have to echo what Hooli said. The only time you want to be bookkeeping your familiar stats is if the familiar is an actual NPC. I mean, whole cloth, right? at which point they should be doing their own stuff. Yeah. So it's a really good question. I was really eager to tackle this one on our podcast because it's a really good question. And here's an open call to all creators out there that are listening. Doing a short supplement on familiars, I think, is a phenomenal idea.
Yeah, I like it. I love your idea about having it as an implement, though. There is so much you can do with that.
Yeah, well, at that point, you could have another guide too. I mean, honestly, an expanded implements guide is a fantastic idea, not just with new implements, but much stronger mechanics and rules around creating them. We took a high level stab at it in our show, right?
Yep, right.
But at that point, you could have not only new implements, but you could introduce an entirely new class of implements, which is familiars, and you could toss a dozen familiar animals in there as implement types. So. But your mileage may vary. Your original point about not treating your familiar like an implement is a good one. And again, a lot of that's down to the role playing and the narrative of the player, right, and how they choose to interact with that thing in the game. But form tends to follow function, and if you go that route, there will probably be, knowing players, the tendency to treat it like a piece of equipment. But to be fair, don't players just do that with familiars anyway? Yeah,
pretty much.
Yeah. So
it is a trope. Oh dear. Very good.
It's good questions. Good questions. Well, Huli, I think that does indeed bring us to the end of yet another show.
Indeed it does. What a great show. Those questions have got my mind racing. But talking about racing, the chases and races was great. So lots and lots of fun there. But look, we'll be back with a new episode very soon with a special guest to help us tackle listener requested topics for the furnace.
I cannot wait for this episode.
And the reason for this, Chris, for his unreasonable excitement, is that we'll be welcoming back to the show Keith Capel to talk about adversary power levels in the Expanded Player's Guide, how they work and how you can and should use them as a GM and creator.
Oh, yes. And of course, guys, we're still working towards a deep dive into Secrets of the Crucible. We want your questions about the book. So if you have any questions or topics related to Secrets of the Crucible or any other questions about Genesys or gaming for that matter, we want you to contact us. Huli, how can they do that?
Well, you can email us at forgegenesis@d20radio.com, or you can post it up via one of our many social media platforms, including Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Reddit. I'm not going to try to roll the R's, by searching at Forge Genesis. And we've, as we mentioned before, we've also been having some great conversations on the D20 Radio Discord server. And of course, our truly dedicated conversations with our Patreons on our very own podcast Discord server.
And we would love to hear from you all. Don't forget, you can also join the even larger discussion in the D20 Radio Facebook group, where we nerds congregate to cross-pollinate. And do not forget, please, to give us a like or a follow as well on any of our social media sites. You can also drop us a review on those sites or on your favorite podcatcher, including iTunes and Spotify. You can also visit us on our website at forgegenesis.com.
Reviews are very important to us.
Very important.
I'm still not going to roll my R's. And yes, let us know what you think, and let others know what you think as well. It also helps to bring us to the top of the queue, and it helps other people find us too with more reviews, which is great. So keep that in mind. You can do reviews on Facebook as well if you're not into Apple Podcasts, but you can also add reviews onto any podcatcher as well. So don't forget that too. Well, that's a wrap for us. Thank you all for listening, and we hope you will join us next time as we continue to explore the Genesys role-playing game. I'm GM Huli. May your triumphs be many and your despairs be few.
And I'm GM Chris, wishing you peace, love, and the good game.
I'm disturbed every time you say that, love. But anyway.
We need love right now, Huli. We need love in the world.
Yeah,
we need
do.
love, we need peace, and we always need good games.
Indeed. Now, thanks again, everyone, for joining us. And remember, the Forge Podcast, helping you hone your gaming edge. The Forge, a Genesys podcast, is a proud member of the D20 Radio Network. For more information about the network, visit www.d20radio.com. The Forge is a fan-generated podcast. All the information provided on the podcast, social media, and related website is not affiliated with Fantasy Flight Games or any of their licensors. The content of this podcast remains the property of The Forge, a Genesys RPG podcast, and is intended for educational and informational purposes only. The Genesys role-playing game, Genesys logo, Genesys Foundry, content, and all material remain the property of Fantasy Flight Games. All products available on the Genesys Foundry website remain the property of their respective companies and individuals. For more information about The Forge, a Genesys RPG podcast, visit www.forgegenesys.com. But then, you've also got the chase scene, or the race scene, should I say, that was in, and now I can't remember the name of the movie. It was done from a book. You're going to remind me shortly. It was done by Steven Spielberg.
You've told me Spielberg recently done from a book. That doesn't narrow things down, bro. What, fantasy, science fiction, modern?
No, it was
like
science
what are we
fiction,
talking?
and basically they were all in this virtual reality type thing. That's what everybody.
Oh, Ready Player One.
That's it. Ready Player One.
So you should have led with that. It was recent. Steven Spielberg from a book, Schindler's List, Saving Private Ryan.
Yeah, I don't think either of those had really good chases in them, but but anyway, Ready Player One had a really good example of things getting in the way.